Hello everyone, today we continue on the Byzantine themes, the reforms of the 7th century, the territorial losses that the empire underwent, and the consequent military autonomization, militarization of the frontier, of the provinces, that could not be immediately relieved from enemy pressure by the central government, the Imperial army of Constantinople, and or wherever the other regiments were concentrated in useful time. As we explained yesterday, these reforms are called like this, as most reforms in many administrative military contexts, not properly as if they had been enacted at a given point in a given year. This is in part a problem due to the lack of documentation of the broader, for example, imagine the bureaucracy that existed in the empire at the time surely registered these changes in quite sort of structural, systemic ways. But also because, as we explained yesterday as well, these changes simply emerged in quite autonomous fashion from the same crisis of the 7th century. And so through the enactment of particular measures that would obviously point on the autonomization of the local defenses, and so the militarization of the local landowners. Mostly we talked about this also already in sort of more in-depth videos about specific frontiers of the empire. Besides, in fact, not all Byzantine lands were, enacting the same type of provisions. There was, for example, like part of the empire was not immediately threatened by any major invasion, right? Paradoxically, if you look at a land, we were talking about that just yesterday, Sicily, also about which I made an important video, in fact, the Byzantine government of the island. Well, that was not immediately threatened during the great crisis of the empire by any major sort of invasion, right? Later on, Saracen piracy was around. The emperor at some point transferred his court to Syracuse, but at some point, Constantinople was under greater threat than Sicily was, right, for different reasons. And so you realize that, for example, in there, provisions would have been different from, say, Baetica, or the same, Italian mainland, as we've seen with the establishment of the Exarchates, that, by the way, Sicily was, for example, autonomous from, also in part for this reason. By the way, as we will learn now, conferring power to specific provincial governors immediately equated to some greater autonomy, also in an autonomistic sense, right? There is all coming back of imperial power in the following centuries at different waves, in fact, under different auspices, so to say. Because one thing is the important reconquest, re-expansion of the empires in Macedonian times, and another thing is the sort of rapacious depredation of, for example, large monastic centers during the iconoclasm, also infringing on the same orthodoxy in pretty inconsistent, sort of religiously inconsistent fashion, right? And in a moment to which the empire had been shattered also by enemies carrying a different fate. Made multiple videos about the iconoclasm that is actually a much more complicated topic than it already seems by itself. So you had to be careful. Think about how Belisarius had been apparently removed for fears of, for example, the generalissimo marching on Constantinople. Heraclius, the great emperor that destroyed the Sasanian Empire, as you know, rose himself as governor of Africa, marching literally from in fact, the central Mediterranean to Constantinople and seizing power. We've seen it in the video about Heraclius himself. So this thematic innovation, so to say, the reforms of the themes, is not to be understood as simply there is the crisis, but now we've figured out the best way to resist it. Here's the jolly card. But no, right? This is an obviously traumatic consequence of a major crisis that at some point not even the center could manage more than much. It's not to say, by the way, that the Byzantine Empire did not display an important resilience as far as the proper foundations of its, especially European basis, or at least the one that had more historically, also in Anatolia, connected with the Greek world, Constantinople, the Aegean, also the Pontic dimension in part. However, things were not ideal in this regard. We've also seen, we will perhaps reinforce this better today, that the themes are not major territorial repartitions, like, for example, the historical regime, say provincial ones of on the basis of which the imperial regiments were historically stationed. In fact, up until the mid 7th century crisis, I made a video about the Byzantine army organization during that early period. We will look at it, in fact, also in the later centuries. But the themes, even though they were mostly of the same scale, but some were more important, less important. Over time, some will sort of take over others, etc. Were smaller administrative districts. So this, in part, reflects some sort of micromanagement possible from the side of the local governors, but also some important precaution that the same central government would have taken in the face of this further autonomization, saying, okay, well, it's sanctioned at least small enough pieces so that one chunk of the empire doesn't start simply going on its own. So there are enormous issues at hand, and probably, again, in the moments in which the thematic administration affirmed itself, emperors and provincial governors were thinking about much more pressing issues than a comprehensive, the ideation of a comprehensive so-called thematic reform per se. Besides, it had not been the first time that the empire had tried to provincialize power for different reasons, that in part were very much connected to, for example, overstretches in the control or the control of regions that, as we highlighted yesterday, such as the ones in the West, seemed sort of also more autonomous just by their own spirit in many ways. In fact, the thematic approach, or at least the principle at the root of it, had been tested intermittently by the same Justinian in certain unstable regions, and was later implemented on a broader scale in the Exarchates of Africa and Italy. The Exarchates were more powerful than the themes. Right, this aspect should be pointed out, that we're looking at sort of bigger regional districts that were also endowed with a peculiar as pregressed autonomy. Right, for example, the Exarchate of Ravenna, that was by far the most important, basically controlled all the Byzantine possessions in peninsular Italy. And so it was actually incredibly powerful as an institution. The exarchs of Italy were just very much, at some point, they also rebelled. At some point, they, the Constantinople had to send forces to essentially curb them, and or they did things that the empire did not simply like in the moment, or simply disobeyed it, because a great part of that decentralization wasn't much like an overall international issue, was just mostly the fact that these lands were truly already functioning on a different basis. They were different people, right? We should understand this very much throughout all Roman history. This solidity of Romanity does not stem from a mere nominal juridical administrative continuity. It stems from the cohesiveness of the people that wielded the empire itself. So it's obvious that the Exarchate of Italy was a more efficient way to govern the peninsula as long as this country had just by itself a previous idea of how to run itself, and was also not really enjoying more than much a more direct Byzantine power imposition, aside from all the problems that the same exarchs really had. As I recently made a video about properly the evaporation of Byzantine authority in most of Italy during these very centuries, and not just because of the Longobards, but also because the same Italians living in Byzantine territory at some point preferred to side with the Longobards, with the Pope, to simply detach themselves in ways that were also much more, let's say, self-aware, much more sort of continuously civil in many ways. We've seen how, for example, the Levantine provinces were very different. Those had not necessarily self-sabotage, because definitely in Syria and Palestine there had been people who had, of course, fought and died against the Arabs. Some Arab allies of the Byzantines, by the way, had fought against the early Muslims as well. But at the same time, those countries were more spent in a sort of politically autonomous direction, meaning that the local communities, yes, at some point were also blessed by, for example, the establishment of, caliphal capitals. Think about Damascus, on a Roman, Sasanian base, in politically, culturally, and so on. But they wouldn't quite simply rule themselves by themselves as single chunks, as single bodies, right? There is an important, as we were pointing out yesterday, degradation of the same late antique system also in these countries, but in a way that was not conducive to for example, the existence of a truly Syrian or Palestinian or Egyptian sort of opinion in the face of the Islamic of the Arab-Islamic rulers, right? Surely these ruled on these regional pools, but in terms of actual, say, participation to the army, in the capacity to maintain, aside from the great caliphal courts, cities particularly active, also in a cultural or civic direction, that's a bit of a different story. Right, we shouldn't overly stress it. Like, it's not like the Arabs arrived and everything was nuked, right, in the process. But these peoples had already been habituated to be ruled by somebody else. That's the same reason why they slipped away from Byzantine rule in that sort of abrupt fashion. The territories that you see remaining in the hands of the Byzantines during the following centuries are mostly the ones that had some sort of more directly participative interest and loyalty towards the concept of the empire, this great, especially thalassocratic or at least coastally, maritimely connected urban world, very much influenced by Greek culture, still surviving infrastructure, etc. The Levantine countries are in part maintaining that. Think about all the for example, the sailors, the ships that allowed for the Arabs to besiege Constantinople at the beginning of the 8th century. Those came from the great ports of the Levant. But if you had analyzed, for example, the level of local political autonomy, also under the Arabs, this does not develop, for example, in the direction of the Byzantine duchies of southern Italy, such as Naples, Amalfi, Gaeta, Sorrento, etc., that truly developed a republican regime and were, in a sense, the first maritime republics of the Middle Ages. So there are important cultural divides and important degrees also of dismantling or erosion, or at least general decline of the late antique system that, however, found in different regions sort of different outcomes out there. For example, in the same, again, Anatolian world, you don't have autonomous republics, right? You don't have them in the Balkans, as we were recalling also in many other videos. Just Thessaloniki is the only true city other than Constantinople that sort of maintains its own aura of city and some political autonomy at the end of the day. But still, all that immense Hellenistic urban world out there was basically shrunk also within the Byzantine heartland. You could argue that the national heartland, roughly approximating to the Greek one in that sense. So also in Justinian's times, the decision to entrust the government of these, for example, Western territories of Africa, of Italy, this is in part valid also because we know those were less important in southern Gaul, southern Spain, were necessarily a decentralized government to some extent, but also in that sense the realization that these were not so important territories anymore. This is not just like, I don't know, in Theodosius' times in which the empire is reunited in some sort, and even if resplit by his children, still maintaining an idea of, well, for example, Rome, that was just reconquered for the sake of a nominal Roman Empire, was so important other than its symbol at that point. Probably the Byzantines realized they did not really have many resources to simply bolster any major refoundation of late antique infrastructure, government, etc., and that those also great reconquests in the West, aside from the broader international and strategical, purposes, including countering this Frankish Atlantic dimension that was growing in unforgettable power, brought the Byzantines mostly as the eastern half of the empire to mostly get the loot, the surplus of all these conquests for their own development in the east, for Constantinople, rather than caring too much about these lands. So again, let's absolutely get rid of the idea that, especially in the interland, because this is really incompatible with Byzantine culture, that the interland mattered, right? For the Greeks, the interland had never mattered for any reason whatsoever, right? And this did not change. So you can argue that the Italian interland was the only truly civilized one, at least in a broader comparative perspective. But the Byzantines are somehow not willingly giving it up, but basically against the Longobards, they don't intervene. Also because, or they do, but at least they fail quite early on, and they decide that they do not have enough resources to even invest anymore in this far away western part of the empire, as they had also much more pressing problems in the very 7th century to deal with in the east. And this is also showed by different other indicators. For example, in our series about medieval law, we observed the issue of the circulation of the Corpus Juris Civilis, which, as you know, is basically the Theodosian code that Justinian reissued with some important, very advanced for the time, in fact, juridical information and update that would also be the basis, in fact, of Roman law during its recovery by the West in the Middle Ages. This is deeply important because the Byzantines went on with their own law, but they didn't have such a dynamic society like the West. That paradoxically was more in line with something more late antique by the time the 11th century, in which the Bolognese school, also the Holy Roman Emperor later, recovered altogether. And also not just because it was the Roman law, but because they were basically integrating that to an already sort of wider system of codes, starting from the Romano-Germanic ones to the feudal customs, to the imperial constitutions, and so on. And this Corpus Juris Civilis was issued in Italy, especially in Italy, because this was, as we've seen, the sort of the major land that had been reconquered by the Byzantines. But basically, in the following generations, we do not. For the following generations, we at least don't have any specific evidence that this Roman law was circulating. was applied, that there was any space essentially for simply, also because these are the generations of when the crisis struck, right? Not just Italy was Longobardized and it adopted. In fact, the Longobard law, by the way, was under Roman influence of the various Roman jurists that helped the Longobards compiling it. One of the single most advanced codes of the era, but one in fact that would resist until essentially the 11th century. Is actually from Longobardistics that Roman law will be revived later on. And so you realize that the level of alienation, especially Western provinces from the East already, was pretty severe. The same can be said for the Levant, that again was lost entirely to the Arabs. So this tells you how critical, in perspective and hindsight, this entire moment really was. We can speak of just like a normal business in terms of civil reforms for some reason. No, this was the consequence of a major crack, the loss of literally a half of imperial territory, and the obvious realization that not much could be done otherwise. Again, I stress the difference between the Exarchates and the themes, because again, it would not be at any other time in later Byzantine history the presence of such big, powerful provincial offices, institutions like the one of the Exarchs, right? Those were incredibly powerful and designed especially for this still sort of pretty advanced Italian and African realities that, however, were also lost by the Byzantines in different ways. So in what had that already consisted? Well, in already you have a militarization of that office when civil duties were transferred to military officials due to the priority of defense needs, right? This was particularly evident in Italy in a broader international fashion, given that the Exarchate of Ravenna proved fairly well effective, allowing Byzantine rule to endure despite Longobard aggression. However, also in there, the picture is a bit more variegated. First of all, the Longobards entered Italy not out of a sheer invasion, but all indicators point to basically an agreement with the Byzantines. When the Longobards entered the Po Valley, sent no force whatsoever to relieve Italy. Later, we know that the same Longobards fought against one another because a good half of them were allied with the Byzantines in Italy. And of course, this had been a conquest, had been an invasion of some sort. But it had been, first of all, tidy, like most of the German settlement in Western Europe. But and secondly, it had, in part, exploited, in fact, this Roman channel, so to say, that the Longobards could benefit of in their same settlement in northern Italy, mostly, again, in that anti-Atlantic, anti-Frankish function that the Byzantines realized also could simply not handle by themselves. So much so that they couldn't even handle the Longobard settlement that came out of hand and began to, again, ravage the peninsula in a very sort of disorderly fashion at the beginning, especially when the Longobards, after the death of Albovin and Clef, were both killed within the same Longobard struggles, in part connected with this, stopped electing a king for 10 years. And at that point you have dukes that, by the way, have just come from Central Europe, didn't even understand the concept of Italy in a broader geographical sense. Some crossed over the Alps over to Burgundy, they were defeated there. Some settled all across the Apennine. I made multiple videos about the pattern of the Longobard settlement. Some Longobards, especially in Benevent, seemingly had already been stationed by the Byzantines after the Gothic War in there and simply rebelled in the moment in which other Longobards, the bigger bulk of the Longobards, arrived from the north at Similia. There is no doubt, however, that the Exarchate did maintain itself in spite of this, and in spite of the fact that basically by the 40s of the 7th century, which are not also random if you look at the chronology of the Islamic invasions in the East, the Byzantines, after different attempts also together with the Franks at that point to get rid of the Longobards, grant the latter basically in exchange for peace, right, or at least a truce of some sort, the de facto recognition of those possessions that the Longobards had already acquired in the moment, right? And after that, we are again in the 7th century, everybody's exhausted in many ways, so the Longobards gradually erode the Byzantine world, also mostly from a social-cultural point of view, because the Italians increasingly side with them, and the same Byzantine part of Italy Italianizes further, so much so that basically there's not even a proper conquest of Ravenna later on. The Longobards simply take it over with a coup or something. We are in the mid-8th century, and they're basically, the Byzantine presence in Italy would remain, especially in the south, but that was the extent also by which the Exarchate could simply, stretch its existence further. So definitely not a policy that left much of a broader marker continuity. Yes, notoriously, the land of around Ravenna, the local province is still called Romagna, after Romania, just as properly how the Byzantine Empire considered itself. But there was no fundamental political continuity with the Exarchate down the line. Everything became Longobardic, aka Italian by that point. So the question is somehow complicated, because if you study this stuff from history books, you could get the wrong kind of approximations, but I think they're very important to make them right. We know how it ended in Africa. That was also threatened by the Berbers of the hinterland. So Africa also has a complex history, because some pockets of imperial power technically remained up to fairly late in time. But if we talk about Africa proper, what would become the Phrygia later, during Islamic rule, this also had been fairly militarized, also thanks to, for example, the maintenance of some Vandal military colonists after the defeat of the major bulk of the Germanic people. We also documented in different videos from a strictly military point of view. And that somehow also took a lot of military costs for the empire. So some scholars go as far as saying, oh, well, the Byzantines should have not bothered reconquering Africa, because this actually extended their frontiers. They had to pay for it. They could have left, the Vandals subjected. Well, the Vandals, first of all, decided to fight against the Byzantine invasion. So they were not simply to say, okay, well, now we will just subject ourselves. And secondly, the crucial point of, again, having a restored naval connection across the Mediterranean could not really entail, again, a random Vandal power that would change colors at every emperor's deposition, whatever, and create further problems. I have studied the Justinian reconquest in some depth, and I must say that the more I do it, the more I think that the notion that this was an overstretch and that it was wrong to do is complete BS, right? The Byzantines did absolutely well in reconquering all those territories. Africa, Italy, even southern Spain, southern Gaul. Nobody whines about those, by the way. In some ways, they didn't even need to. Like southern Gaul, we don't even know whether an actual campaign actually occurred. But again, if anything, in another video, we can describe the context better. But indeed, like cementing the control of these lands was particularly important, especially considering the advantages that this would confer to an importantly maritime power. Naturally, what happened later, including the pandemic, whatever, like could have not simply been foreseen, nor the struggle against the Sasanians that went on for other generations, as you know. So you don't know better than a Byzantine 6th, 7th century emperor how to run his domains, in his stead, right? So let's be serious here. Then we have the same approach of mostly conferring further military power, as we've seen for the Exarchs, due to stringent emergential military situations in 7th century Asia Minor, in 7th century Anatolia. Though here, also considering the times and places, we know much less about what actually happened. I mean, as you know, Anatolia would remain an important chunk of the Byzantine Empire, where actually also most of its military power would rest at a point, with the Anatolian thematic constituting the backbone of Byzantine cavalry, up to Manzikert and or right around there, as I explained in another video. Not even Manzikert was decisive for the loss of Anatolia at all. And for this ambiguity, it remains uncertain whether the so-called thematic reform, which finds its sort of more, say, its fuller profiling in this area, also because it's a sort of quite compact continental landmass where you can look at all the various themes like next to one another, whether their establishment occurred under Heraclius, after reclaiming territories from Sasanian occupation, which would have been an important, by the way, moment in which to redraw part of the local administration. Because as you know, the Persians had arrived up to Constantinople. They had besieged the city together with the Avars. So this speaks volumes also of how the Anatolian hinterland was for the cornerstone of the Byzantine Empire. Sure, it's not like the Byzantines were happy that the Persians were running to Anatolia, but just like if you travel to Anatolia today, there's literally nothing. I've never been to Constantinople, and as you know, I never used the other name. Just a dear colleague and friend of mine was there and told me, like, well, it's amazing. You should visit there, even though, yes, there is less than, I don't know, in Rome or other. But the funniest thing is, in Europe, you find on the European side of the Bosphorus, you find the most beautiful stuff for the city, obviously. Well, I mean, this sounds obvious, but when you cross into Asia, there isn't shit. And my father also, when he was younger, he used to travel a lot through motorcycle, and he made a lot tour of the Anatolian hinterland. He told me himself that there is really nothing. It's just as you approach Constantinople, back also, in fact, from the Asian side, that you see all the traffic sort of converging towards that. Otherwise, in between, there is hardly much, right? And naturally, of course, my father is not so ancient as Heraclius, but more or less the civilizational distribution within Anatolia remained the same since ancient times. So it's important to pose ourselves such question overall. Also because these Anatolian lands for a while will be lost again in the early 8th century in the same identical way to the Arabs, right? And retaken by the Byzantines. So what happened then, right? It could have been in either period, so literally could have been Heraclius or 100 years later, and or simply there could have been previous administrative districts that we don't know of, or at least particular forms of local government that were already taking shape and at some point were remolded by these events and or were reestablished after the war. Definitely did not really help to stiffen also some magically more advanced form of government through the themes themselves. Again, as we explained yesterday, these and today as well, again, this reform stemmed out of a crisis, of an emergency. So it wasn't done with sort of velvet gloves, nor it was something that the Byzantines themselves would have done otherwise compared to how they were faring before. Right. In any case, we can witness the establishment of the themes. By the latter half of the 7th century, Anatolia saw the establishment of the themes of the Anatolics, documented from 669. So again, we have these specific dates stemming from random sources, right? Random sourcing. By the way, this is somehow an appropriate time in which you can't start calling Anatolia as opposed to Asia Minor. That is more of a classical name. In fact, the term Anatolics derived from Anatole, which means east in Greek, referring in this case properly to the armies of the east, because as we have understood, these themes were military cornerstones, and there would be a mix of sort of more professional soldiery and local levies. So the name was given technically by the inhabitants in some sense. In fact, the Armeniacs first noted in 667, and the Opsikion or Opsicians recorded from 680, and led by a count, with the name Opsikion deriving after an elite imperial unit that had been titled after the Latin term obsequium. So literally Opsikion from there. You understand how mixed and wild, also in a sort of switch from Latin to Greek transliteration or adaptation, that this happened, right? In somehow very random ways, and in some cases it would actually keep happening this way, because this seemed also some sort of provisional government, given the fact that, again, the enemies of the empire had been occupying these territories up to a few time before, even though they had historically been Roman. There was also the maritime theme of the Carabisianoi along the southern coast of Asia Minor, first referenced between 680 and 690. We know very well how, since antiquity, that southern part of essentially today's Turkey was sort of versed for naval stuff. We've seen it also in the video about the Achaemenid Marines. It's levied from this coastal subject of the kings of kings. The creation, and naturally, of course, imagine at this time we're a few decades away from the same siege of Constantinople that happened again from the side of the Arab army and fleet. A lot of Saracen piracy around, and as we've seen also in the video about Byzantine naval tactics, lots of maritime expeditions, also just sort of supporting the cargoes that were supplying the armies moving along the coast, as normally navies were employed for at the time, took place in these areas. You have Cyprus just south of that. You have just the Aegean Islands close to it, Crete. So a lot of things going on. The creation of new themes continued over time. So it wasn't just like an immediate reform, right, of the entire empire being parceled into these districts. It's evident, however, that the creation of the smaller units corresponded to some sort of more gradual progress in the imperial reconquest, and or, again, the aforementioned needs to keep it compact, small, and manageable, given the circumstances. Also because you could provincialize defense. Say, if the enemy was to, at some point, attack you somewhere, you couldn't have just a single center ruling vast areas, because it was very difficult in these critical times just to have enough connections. Yes, ideally that a bigger center would have been more robust, but you had Constantinople, and if you had even this sort of central towns of the province that needed to be besieged by the enemy to be taken over, that was enough to pin the enemy and try to attack him with some field armies with a fleet and so on. In fact, themes were created across centuries, right, to include reconquered territories and reaching Europe by the end of the 7th century with the themes of Thrace and Hellas. This aspect is relevant because these territories had not been taken over. And so basically the Byzantines decided to uniform their more sort of European core land of the Aegean through and the Black Sea in the case of Thrace, through like the models that they had applied to the east, to Anatolia. The theme system thus transformed provincial administration, replacing the complex late antique system of prefectures, dioceses, and provinces. These had been established by Diocletian, right around those times, Constantine, etc., with new districts directly accountable to central government. You know how complex and almost perverse the Diocletian reform really was, how dirigistic, how really the attempt to redraw an older imperial cohesion through, by the way, increasing bureaucracy, etc. Those times were very far. They were very far even in the age of Justinian. But even in the age of Theodosius, things had actually already simplified. And so with the final collapse of late antiquity, at least by some standard, you can observe in the themes the ultimate sort of more and simpler, more cheaper form of local government, right? There was naturally also a greater importance of Constantinople, a lesser importance of the other cities around. We've explained this already. This facilitated things a bit much, also because the smaller centers now were obviously more dependent on Constantinople, even just out of defense. That was the big mother city that could succor them in case of need and more, that had properly the assets, the infrastructure to provide also with a bigger military force, at least getting it from also different parts of the empire, a navy, like with a hell of a port, of a strategic position, international posture, etc. The dominance of military leadership also enabled in the themes more effective responses to enemy pressures at the borders, providing a strong defensive framework that contributed to the Byzantine survival. This is kind of obvious when you look at especially the steppes themes, at least for example, the Balkan ones that had to cope with populations coming from the Pontic area were more intense, but most of the times those themes had mostly to cope with some sort of lower intensity skirmishes, raids, waves of peoples that were at large not even capable of simply settling down. They had to come back to their steppes, pastures, in order to refurbish their forces, etc. So there is a complex fortificatory system that in part had remained from the previous centuries. This is a very beautiful and fascinating topic. I want to make one video especially about, for example, the locks of northern Italy. Those houses since, say, late antiquity, the 3rd century, throughout all Longobard times up to the Carolingians, you realize that Europe was already in different parts of the world, including Anatolia, etc., were fortified. But they had been fortified in that way from millennia, right? And with structures naturally are difficult to simply document, even archaeologically, because in part there were temporary structures, or at least there were sort of motte and bailey fortifications with timber and dirt, etc. They weren't something you can simply dig out, or say at this point even stone was very difficult to, very costly if anything, to employ, if not by reusing it from ancient monuments and stuff like that. But of course, you can imagine how, in spite of the crisis, in spite of the shrinking, how complex the Byzantine defense system really was. And defensively speaking, of course, there is always an intrinsic advantage that at some point you have to exploit through a counteroffensive. For that, the Byzantines had many troops at different times employed on the frontiers. In all this, it's not like soldiers simply evaporated or were not there anymore. There were lots still of federative simakoi. We see it through different sources very well, but at the same time, manpower becomes more precious. You simply have less resources for supplying the armies, for sustaining its logistics, and so digging in, entrenching against most of the enemies of the empire is fundamentally enough not to incur into major losses. Then, of course, major regional campaigns from different peoples will be carried out, and or maybe even just provincial ones, for which the teams at least had to face enemies of their same scale, the same strength, because that's at the end of the day how war is mostly waged, right? There are beautiful frontier warfare circumstances. Again, the East is less documented, unfortunately. We know much better what was happening in the West for obvious reasons, and reflect on the fact that we don't know this much from Byzantine historiography, especially at this time, right? As long as we have the Strategicon does not talk about a history of warfare, but say obviously if you have Procopius for the Gothic War, you have different sources also for Heraclius campaigns against the Persians, etc. But afterwards we know things fairly better through, say, Western sources about the Lombard Byzantine frontier, for example. And the 7th century is notoriously the darkest hour also for Byzantine literature. I remember at university I had, during my master, a Byzantinist that had to teach us history, and he was actually quite good at it. At least he was a very serious guy. He cared about what he said, etc. But his education was history of literature, right? And he told us that basically, so this guy had studied fundamentally Greek literature of the Byzantine era. And so he had specialized into, even in all of the possible Byzantine ages, in 7th century, if I remember correctly, monastic literature, properly the darkest thing ever. And in fact, he was telling us in some sort of bitter way that if he talks with, say, a Grecist or someone who studies, I don't know, classical Hellenic literature, basically he's considered like a pariah. Nobody wants to even talk to him in those environments because of the lower level. The Hellenic classicists are by far the worst type of, especially like in fields like philology, literature. Historians are cool, but those other fields are radically violent. They are something terrible. You think that who studies literature is a mentally, but they're all radically ideologized. Paradoxically, it's history, the least ideologized field in the academia. I mean, even math is radically ideologized. In any case, the theme system was complemented by the introduction, of course, of a new military system of some sort. At least that's something we will picture better in an adequate military history video. But fundamentally, you have these military colonists, the soldiers, farmers, simply known as stratiotai, that, as you know, is a pretty standard term in Greek for soldier, or something around that, because naturally that's a Latin term, whereas here the Greek has sort of different etymological roots. In any case, this guy received state-granted land to farm in return for hereditary military service. So these people were standing out from the rest of the community because they were essentially functionalizing for military service. This is very interesting, obviously, because it was all based on some sort of rota system that you can observe also in other societies, like in the West. There's nothing really strange, especially down the line. We were saying it just yesterday. It's not like the major differences that existed between these civilizations in absolute terms, especially from a 21st century perspective, were huge or whatever. The system down the line worked in practically the same fashion, just it was more or less balanced depending on the political and social premises of these countries. Besides, this military colonism had a lot in common with one of the Limitani, the border troops of late antiquity. There is, however, an important difference, because the late antique army had historically come from a sort of much more robust force that, in fact, existed across a wider empire that, in practice, had fundamentally held from a territorial point of view. We know that part of the reason, at least in the broader decline before the big crack of the 7th century, in fact, the latter had occurred, was that the Limitani that had kept existing throughout these various centuries had basically waned, right? These military colonists were often just sort of local militia that most of the time didn't even, in fact, serve in arms or was particularly up to it, or just fully geared for that, didn't care very much. This is naturally typical of certain, of an unprofessional system, and so it can't be understood. But in certain frontiers, especially in the East, that lifestyle had properly collapsed. Besides, some frontiers had also shrunk. Think about what happened to the Balkans, right? If Limitani historically had been mostly stationed along the Danube, at this point, the river only nominally constituted the boundary of probably Imperial territory. The Balkans had hundreds of kilometers in depth that had been, by the way, largely Slavicized. And imagine just being a Limitanus, or however it would have been called, there after these centuries, and simply thinking, what am I actually doing? The military and cultural and socioeconomical preconditions for that had basically exhausted themselves. It was easier, especially in a Byzantine cultural perspective, to defend the cities, right, and to tie the interland populations to the ports at the end of the valleys that they inhabited, with trade, with exchanges, with this broader, also, of course, military deterrent that could be at some point unleashed here and there with more mobile forces. But again, everything had sort of melted away. Now, what actually happened was a remilitarization of a population that now, of course, was feeling the necessity of rearm, even in time of crisis, evidently, also, and especially in times of crisis. Think about today, like people complain because they say, there is a threat, but I don't want to spend the money to be defended from that. Okay, so die. We don't need you in that sense. And we can at least gather your properties later and, use them for arming ourselves better. But people are mentally feeble to that point up until somebody kicks them in the teeth. And so eventually things always work in some direction. This is the case, in fact, of the Byzantine themes as well, right? Naturally, as we explained yesterday, especially the levy militias were a lower tier army compared to the mobile field forces. All right, so not much had really changed. And we know that this is how literally the Limitani had gradually evaporated. Justinian partially disbanded many of their units because he had realized that it was useless to even keep supporting them, given that they were so ineffective. But as we know, in fact, in Justinian times, the strategic profile of the empire, regardless of the re-expansion, was using sort of more equilibristic means, including the aforementioned use, for example, of Vandals, of Goths, of Longobards, that were plenty of, like in the Byzantine army, also sent to, to the Caucasus, to everywhere, rather than using an actual sort of national force. I also explained this in the video about the Maurician Cavallery as part of the mostly Bushellari forces, but not only. Like everything was tendentially going towards a privatization of the system, but it was obviously the same, always the same picture. Like getting, if anything, some foreigners, somebody that, for even just by lifestyle, had historically learned how to fight. That the system could supply, and then leaving the meeker population to work for them, right? And at this point, this meeker population could simply had no choice but to be rearmed, at least as a sort of militia. Besides, as you know, this ideal of the soldier-farmer system is quite central to Byzantine historiography, because this would conventionally die in the later Macedonian era. Basil II would be the last to try some kind of save of the system. By the Komnenian era, basically this system did not quite exist anymore. They started using mostly mercenaries, also from different peoples all around. So the idea that the soldier-farmer was somehow the backbone of the Byzantine military for, so how long? 400 years, is a bit ideal, right? It's just like saying that, I don't know, the longbow was, the English weapon that made the 100 Years' War, or something like that. Obviously, these troops were always somehow scarce in quality. If anything, they were present in large numbers, but you couldn't simply, in this time of crisis, squeeze them particularly. If anything, for demographic concern, you couldn't exhaust manpower, you couldn't exhaust labor force. So even this great reform, from a military standpoint, doesn't even seem to have technically been there, right? It's just like move your backside, because, otherwise there will get all killed. And the Byzantine military actually maintaining its standards, even in times of crisis, or at least there was a further destructuring even at that level. But of course, there was always a professional military that maintained the core, especially of field troops, right? And this is true also for any army out there. The Romano-Germanic kingdoms had the same form of organization. The Arabs had the same form of organization. So again, everything went along the same patterns, right? There are two reasons, however, that can be naturally seen as a plus of this system. First of all, having lots of sort of local militiamen, especially in defense, alleviated the empire's burden of maintaining an expensive professional army that at least had to tap all these various gaps that were forming on the frontier. Even though, again, this also in turn came at a cost, while simultaneously establish a dedicated force of soldier farmers who were more motivated to protect their land than sometimes other forces had been. In which sense, I wouldn't stress much the need of defending sort of the country per se, because if you look at professional soldiers that were definitely way more motivated, especially when actually paid, to even just for the sake of their lifestyle, to preserve the system, right? So let's debunk this notion that if you are a paid soldier of some sort, and what's the difference in that sense with a mercenary? Mercenaries do not exist in this regard. That is also, this is notorious in military circle terms, going to be the gold standard of military reliability. All right, it's not like you may have at some point more disloyal soldiers for some reason, some political intrigue, whatever. But it's not like they're less motivated and less efficient than some levy militia. Right, the levy militia in and of itself is less effective, and it also can't do some things that the professionals can do, especially having a field army with an actual shock force and spearhead spearheading capacity against a regional threat, right? What instead this soldier-farmer system was particularly important for is the capacity of socially countering the process of privatization and oligarchization of the system. It actually was very advanced by this point. For example, the Bucellari had the story where these private magnates that, or better, they were the name of the soldiers, but they were basically private armies run by essentially Byzantine magnates of sort, right? The big landowners, etc. That could simply get the scum of the earth all around, even from barbarians, and transforming them as a sort of foreign legion. This is especially evident if you look at the incredible multicultural nature of Belisarius' armies, like say the age of Justinian, Narses, etc. In the quite efficient ones, because as we've seen, they steamrolled the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, etc., without too much problem. They were indeed quite heterogeneous, and on the longer run, in fact, could not quite hold up more than much. If you really look at how the Byzantine army was organized as a whole, it was pretty messy compared to previous times. It's not like it didn't work, but it makes you think also regarding, for example, the allegiance, yes, of these other troops. More than that, especially if they were foreign, more than that, but not only, again, if they were paid, they were good. However, when you realize that this was also happening because the average peasant soldier of, say, the age of Augustus, or that already lived in a quite oligarchic system, telling the truth, say, way more oligarchic than one of the Polybian legions, so to say, you can appreciate how this further degradation towards like some guy taking over because there is no rush, there is no pressure, and no other people in arms is partly stopped. Naturally, we shouldn't be fooled by this. We made enough videos about Byzantine society to know that this was a traumatically oligarchic system, that Byzantine society had known of the thriving character of the Western one. I would argue even already at this time. And it was probably a matter of mental cadres. That there was sort of another approach, just for the fact that, as we explained before, there was really not much of an interland participation to Byzantine civilization as such. That when you look at these thematic forces as well, you even wonder who these people really were, because among these soldier farmers were maybe just some Slavs arrived from God knows where that didn't even speak Greek, and you know they were co-opted, like and coacted in pressed into this militia system, and just because there were peasants that lived there, right? So we should not exaggerate by any stretch of the imagination the myth of the peasant soldier, because again, it was something that deteriorated in Roman society already by the time of Marius. You can imagine how he was at the time of Heraclius. So for God's sake, like let's be honest about it. Nevertheless, again, by themselves, by being armed and having the state backing them in that function, which also created some attrition with provincial, if anything, with the landed nobility to some extent, there was some standard that could be maintained also at the statal level in terms of actual political participation. What you actually see in the West is something similar, and actually more advanced, because there was even more autonomy and liberty there, also greater per capita wealth, especially in certain areas. So what, say, the Byzantine system was sort of good for was also no secret or no magic formula. It was basically what the system at the time sort of helped. Besides, let's realize this, that having just lots of militiamen does not mean to have a strong army. Right? This is not really an army, right? Only the professionals are an actual army. You can have levies that accompany them, but they're more like auxiliary forces, all right? And the empire, by the way, keeps using lots of foreigners, right? Lots of Armenians, for example. I made even a bit about the Armenian soldier in the Byzantine army of the era, and more. There were lots of them. There were the Serbs that had just arrived, made a bit about their ethnogenesis, their settlement in their empire. Really, you named them, because definitely the empire was geographically located in quite a crucial corner of the world. Much of its stability also deriving from the control of those straits of the Black Sea, of the Aegean, of the Balkans, of Anatolia, etc. The establishment of soldier farmers was likely facilitated also by the reduction of the same large estates due to the destruction caused by major military events of the period, allowing the government to redistribute land to free peasants. So remember what we said. When does late antiquity die? It is because, the terrible barbarians invaded this land, and the latifundium collapsed, and everything. It happened in the same identical way within the Byzantine Empire. Again, by a different degree, this is true. The Byzantine Empire maintained largely that system. But it's obvious that to this collapse, like the latifundium could simply not survive intact. And so obviously there were now many former colonists that in a sense were now freer peasants to a degree. There wasn't much in, again, Byzantine socioeconomic potential that could simply render these peasants particularly productive. It's not like even in the West, again, being a random guy with a farm out there in the open somewhere is a romantic or successful way of living, right? But as far as the perpetuation of the Byzantine state was concerned, this shrinking, this redistribution of wealth was fundamentally positive. It helped sort of fostering a sense of, okay, now I will be exploiting this situation even as an individual to gain more power, to get to bear arms, to have a status of sorts that I can transmit to my descendants, so not to have other landowners infringing on my property, which still continued to happen because throughout Byzantine history, we know continuously that there were abuses of landowners that tried to occupy some free peasants' fields, even when they were actually part of military colonies, so that at some point the same emperors urged to sort of to make further reforms to help these guys, etc. But it was a process of decadence, of deterioration, de facto feudalization that we observe pretty much everywhere. And it's not like the Byzantine Empire simply remained the same old thing, because that's also part of the meme, right? That the Byzantine Empire continued to be the same exact thing it had been before, etc. This is not the case. When you study it in comparison to the West, you realize that the same level of destructuring, the same level of transformation, or at least the same dynamics, regardless of the degree that occurred to the West, are the same happening in the East. And they are the major sort of historiographical point of it all. So this is important because just as a basic evidence, dismantles the notion that the Byzantine Empire was somehow preserving some golden rule that made it functioning while the rest of the world was not functioning. They were fully invested by all the crises that also the West was hit by, in some cases even in a harder way, and again, because of certain characteristics that also had been historically different from the West, there is no doubt, but not in a way that by pre-industrial standards for these still European civilizations, you could sort of draw radical lines to separate them without any resemblance or some higher merit of value. Now, organized into village communities, the aforementioned peasant soldiers formed at least the numerical bulk of the army, and in civilian life created a robust class of small landowners that served the empire's productive foundation and its most dependable source of tax revenue throughout the Middle Byzantine period. Obviously, by definition, there is nothing particularly glorious about this. It's just a peasant levy. All right, it's nothing special. It's not the superhero that saves the empire. There's some civic ethos in all this. There is if you want to see it, a continuation to some models of peasant soldiery of the ancient world again, but this existed practically everywhere. Like if you look at what, again, all the neighbors were doing, the migration era had definitely brought to a, if anything, you can say to a remilitarization, at least to a greater exposure to the need of picking up arms. At the same time, as we have well seen, it had socially stratified the system where there was this underclass of peasants and an elite. And this elite at the beginning of the Middle Ages, in the moment of greatest contraction, of course, was less powerful in relative terms than it would be later, meaning that, yes, from a moral point of view, we're already dominant in a sense. If anything, because also their cavalry had the upper hand more often than not over the same infantry. And this was the case for the Byzantine Empire as well. But there was not enough surplus for this elite to be so powerful, which is also the same reason why, I don't know, you have to wait the revival of the 11th century to have, in fact, within the same Byzantine Empire, what the, say, wealth were increasing, but it's mostly controlled by elite. These soldiers go finally under, and so there is mostly the pronoia system that has them not even completely bypassed, because the retinue of the pronoia is still constituted by infantrymen. That does never end, right? But there are sort of different ties, relative liberties entail that you should study from time to time. But again, the level of privatization and sort of this transclanatory mindset and dependencies of 7th century Byzantine peasants were pretty much the same. You can see throughout also the previous and later eras in many ways. Just they were a bit freer, even though they were actually also a bit more miserable, like everybody involved in this time of great moral and material shortage. And so sort of idealizing, romanticizing this system as, look, later emperors fought to keep this class alive. Yes and no, right? The West was more straightforward in a broader feudalization, at least in most parts of it, and also the ones that would become more military effective, by the way. And so there is also the great question, should have the Byzantines followed more like a feudal direction? That's also pretty sterile up to a certain point. Now, the societal changes under Heraclius, or right around him, were primarily defined by the growing influence also of religion in public life. This may seem strange, but with the eradication of lingering pre-Christian elements, the church deeply shaped and became an integral part of society as well, right? Or at least it fully took over this broader moral purpose of, say, protecting the populations, the same peasantry. This is very interesting because in this moment of crisis, there was, as we explained yesterday as well, a reinforcement of, if anything, of conservative thinking, of the necessity of communal cohesion and identity. So obviously enough, in these lands that had, generally speaking, been of old Christianization, the Catholic message, in the moment in which, the same imperial order was put into question, was endangered, researched, right, had definitely a motivating effect. There was definitely a Byzantine pride connected to this, and a general sense, of course, of entitlement almost regarding the one imperial title. Besides, we should point out that if you study 7th century, military, Byzantine military ethos, you would think like this was an age of full Christianization. So again, the false notion of, again, the Christianity weakening the soldiers, making them less combat effective, whatever, should be evident or something. If you study the few evidence that we have about 7th century Byzantine military eaters, and for that matter the one of later times, you realize that the same taste for blood, glory, conquest, victory, etc. Was there among the Byzantine soldiery that was literally obsessed with the Iliad, with Heraclius, with basically the same old myths of the Hellenic tradition that had, as we explained also in the video about the hoplites, actually always made even the most amatorial fighter in this society just obsessed with psychopathic serial killers like Achilles, that were really literally what you have to be in many ways as a good soldier. And I'm literally meaning this in a positive sense. And that also in terms of symbolism of lions killing, ferocious animals, there are all symbols that resonate deeply. There are also very straightforward influences from, for example, neighboring countries. Right? The fact, for example, I don't know if you look at the lion hunts on the Middle East, the Sasanian Persians, etc., you realize that with their mind, the Byzantines had basically always remained there. They hadn't really moved. They had acquired themselves like that influence from the Persians, just as the Persians had acquired an influence from the same Byzantines and the Roman ethos. So this it's difficult to speak of re-Christianization, but you see, together with this ties well with the iconoclasm as well. With this provincialization of the themes, there is a huge deal of reconnection with the local communities, right? And by this time, there are, for example, very big, rich monasteries, right, that foster also for some localistic autonomism against the same central empire, so that the actual sense of cohesion that we're looking at is not much towards a broader empire. There is that too, and it works. But in many cases, there is also, why don't we, like, if we are so self-reliant, why don't we start negotiating with the center as well? And the iconoclasm will brutally put an end to this by sacking, targeting, especially monasteries that had become a bit like the also the center of all these local traditions, the receptacle of the what could be salvaged, also the ancient Pelasgian, sometimes superstitions, all right, the sense of attachment, not just from the soldiers that would have had more Apollonian models, but let's say also the peasantry that as militia levies, these guys, as we've seen, also were, that truly protected, like in a spiritual sense, the community, and were seen as a major factor of spiritual and cultural identity glue altogether, right? So we shouldn't, this is not simply, some emperor's decision or not. There are straightforward retraditionalization of symbols at times. Under Justinian, we find the same similar, for example, the angelic symbology was preponderantly present in Justinian's times in ways that had historically not been so strong up to that point, even though the eagle, the Holy Ghost, had historically been preserved as the same iconography. The Germans had a lot to do with that. The steppes peoples reinjected much of these kind of ideas, and even in the military ethos that we described, in fact, mostly among the elite professionals, the actual knights, because these were something comparable to that. They weren't just horse archers or lighter. They were, generally speaking, lighter troops than the Westerners, but trying at some point to distinguish a Longobard Arimanus from a Byzantine Caballarius in the in the early 7th century, I don't know, Longobards Byzantine frontier is particularly complicated. Also because very often they were the same person in many ways through the federati and so on. Because that idea that the foreigners, still from the time of federati, are usually the soldiers, this is still pretty much there. There are Greeks, there are people that, again, also rise through the ranks from this local military administration. But there isn't much of a doubt regarding this important social military consolidations. A clear example of this spiritual shift is seen, however, also within the imperial court ceremonial. In fact, you can't take this from a long time, but from the 5th century, the emperor was crowned by the Patriarch of Constantinople. From 641 onward, coronations took place in the church of Hagia Sophia rather than before assembled troops, moving away from the originally militaristic nature of the investiture. It should be pointed out that in the West that practice continued for a longer time. There wasn't at least a single emperor of the West crowned by the Pope, which, however, is just a century and a half away. And by the way, that again, sense of imperial grandeur and support also by the church was also at a regional and provincial level carried out in the West, even among the Arians. Right now. Another significant development was the adoption of Greek as the official language of the empire. We've already seen it yesterday in part, leading to the decline of Latin knowledge. Now, why? Because in great part, also the territories that were lost brought to, in a way or another, to an increase of Greek as the most common language spoken to begin with already. For example, there was, especially up until the Slavization of the Balkan hinterland, still a Latin of the Danube. Right? You would think that in the eastern half of the empire, everybody was influenced by Greek, right? Not really, right? Latin arrived all the way the Danube went, right? And even beyond, you can argue, from the historical Italic colonization. Greek was historically preponderant in these regions that had never really stopped using it. However, Greek had ceased to be merely the primary language of literature, as it had been in the early Byzantine period. It extended to politics, administration, army, right? Sometimes maintaining, by the way, the same Latin terms, but their Greek version of it, their Hellenization, which is weird because, again, like they would have had some kind of Hellenic equivalent, but that is a testament to the legacy also of Latin language to begin with, especially in those basic branches of the Byzantine state that had been made by Rome. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. The emperor also transitioned from Latin titles to Greek ones. While Latin remained the court language, the emperor was referred to with titles such as Imperator, equivalent to the Greek Autocrator, Caesar, and Augustus. This aspect, by the way, that Latin remained the court language is quite significant because it tells you what kind of higher standards overall the language spoken by the Romans really had. So remember this when you argue that this was also just some shift, like of Byzantinism, without reminding the importance of the Latin West and its legacy. Even though great part, as we've seen, of that territory where Latin, its Romance evolution was spoken, was not considered Byzantine. Like, it's not like the Byzantine emperors, by speaking Latin at their court, actually said, we would like to be in Italy again, so at least there people speak the same language. They didn't care about that. It was more like about properly the concept of tradition standing behind Romanity. But of course, they were quite well sort of Eastern and Greek in many other ways to know, first of all, how to speak the language, but still maintaining for a while this Latin spoken at court. This is incredibly important. Naturally, if we look at the generations before, Justinian's protocols, for instance, adhered to the Roman format. There was the prenomen imperator, the nomen Caesar Flavius Justinianus. Naturally, we talk here like the ecclesiastical pronunciation because we think mostly that's how they pronounced this at that point already. And the cognomina, Francicus, Germanicus, Vandalicus. These were, the epithets commemorating real or alleged Byzantine military victories. That's also a very interesting chapter we'll have to open at some point. Pius Felix Victor ac triumphatur semper Augustus, right? Naturally, there was two Byzantine, let's say, the Byzantine Empire, a different ethos of that had much like the old, much like to the Hellenic tradition of how properly the concept of, for example, of Sebastocrator was concerned. The relation with the church had historically been, since Constantinian times, much more impositive towards the local patriarchate. The way the Byzantine emperor was seen was still sort of very hieratic, ever more, as we've seen, secluded from even much more indiscriminate public assemblies. Even the army was for security measures at some point, right? So there is plenty, really, of different characters, features. There's a much greater orientalization, as we said before, the Persian influence at court, the Perscuneses having become really a big thing. These are things, for example, in the West you don't see anymore. Of course, there is also not a Roman emperor anymore, but historically the West had not gone down that specific path in as much as at least the Byzantines had. Alongside those traditional titles, we find terms like dominus, in fact, properly the concept of lord, in Greek kurios, which is also the etymology of Christ, despotes, that is, you can translate it as lord again, and basileus. Basileus is quite interesting because it's it has to do with the concept of basilicon, etc., but it was more like of a kingly epithet that, as you know, existed also in Hellenism, right? And you can find the etymology, I think, tracing back to the Mycenaean, and it is to some extent also relatively obscure in meaning. It would be some sort of local chieftain, court official, whatever, but it had sort of run rampant by the time of the Adochoi. And as you know, it would eventually give the name to the same Basileiaton Romaion, for saying, like, I don't know, Egypt had what was a Basileia historic, like Ptolemaic Egypt. The Seleucids were Arche. Macedon was more like Macedonia, straightforward, also because we're sort of more egalitarian, that idea, but it was also, the title was Basileus also there. So that's something, for example, that the West never used, right? It wasn't the title of Rex in the West. You have Imperator, which is another idea. And it's not like the term Rex had not been used, but it had been diminished and compared to the imperial title. For example, Odoacer, or Theodoric had been Reges, right? So it's another vocabulary. Basileus especially was used from early on and eventually became official, together with Kyrios, despotes as well. And so you don't find this in the West. You don't find this in the Latin vibe of imperial Romanity. The imperial protocol was revised in an official sense under Heraclius, because up to that point, these titles had been relatively ambiguous. Again, every emperor could also style himself as he wanted, even though, of course, words mattered. He couldn't literally use whatever he wanted without reactions, right? But let's say Heraclius says, okay, we have now to redraw a bit the world, the universe, also because he thought, especially after having destroyed the Persians, that everything was one, that the Roman Empire would have existed forever, would have been so large and beautiful. The Arabs knocked at the door. But we know that Heraclius, after the victory over the Sasanians, issued a law in his name and that of his son, using the Greek formula that translated goes faithful emperors in Christ, which is also a very interesting denomination. Despite occasional resurgences of the old protocol, with, for example, Augustus / Sebastos linked to Basileus, and the continued use of Latin legions and coins under, until the iconoclastic period, Autocrator and Augustus fell out of use, and the emperor was officially designated Basileus, while Augusta remained for the empresses. At some point later on, there was also the term Augustus used for other elements of the family or something. But this depends also on the year and the time. This aspect is interesting because also in a broader metaphysical sense, because the title of especially Augustus, Sebastos, they have in the same etymology in the Indo-European, the respective Indo-European languages, together with, in fact, Sebastocrator, Autocrator, etc., represented for the East especially a great deal of continuity with actually a very traditional way of majesty and royalty, right? Well, I will make, if anything, some video about this to explain it better, because historically this had come with a very important idea, especially of the centrality of the ruler superior to, for example, the influence of priesthood, of the clergy, especially in Christian times. And this, in fact, remained a bit in the Byzantine world, where the emperors dictated rule to the patriarchs of Constantinople, also to the popes, even though those, sent them to go blip themselves and, in fact, did not succeed, also for a reason. You can argue that part of why the Byzantine Empire sclerotized historically was exactly this suffocation of local of autonomy, including also the ecclesiastical one in general, full of standard of the same emperor that still believed in a very Dorian, sort of Hellenic fashion that the world was perfect because it was run by the Byzantines. And so whatever was Byzantine was Roman in that sense. And as Roman, it was perfect. It couldn't be changed. Again, it was a bit the idea, we recalled it later, of the perpetua sanctio that is explicitly expressed, for example, at the beginning of the Theodosian Code instead of the Justinian one as well, as if, imagine even in perspective of the time, where people maybe worked for a lifetime, didn't even realize that they had improved their condition through their surplus, right, of the peasantry, for working the field for an entire life and getting at the end of it just maybe a 4% of extra wealth. If things went like that, the world would never change. That essentially the way the world was organized was more or less going to remain the same. This is very important to understand, not just especially Byzantine mentality, but really the pre-industrial world in general, the Middle Ages in particular, or even the older eras. In as much as say, the immanence of power was understood as a matter of action, of current action, even though there were, of course, prophecies in pre-Christian and Christian tradition, naturally expecting the decline of the degeneration of the world. This was seen also in cyclical terms as not suddenly collapsing, right? And so there was this great prism that the universe was, that in some sense reflected, especially if the emperor was virtuous enough, that divine proximity, whereby if upheld, like it would have, like the cosmic order would have never collapsed. And the Byzantines were deeply convinced of that. It was the same identical idea that the Greeks had, because in turn the Dorians, that in Europe were the most successful conquerors because they got the best land, and they literally centered the world into Delphi, into like properly an idea that was the greatest achievement ever. They thought they were so perfect. Just think about the Hellenic idea of proportions, of geometrical harmony. It's a heavy Indo-European legacy, and also a great deal of historical, social-cultural continuity. A lot of stratification in Greece, paradoxically, also with, in fact, non-Indo-European elements or pre-Indo-European Pelasgian concept and so on, as you can see from Hellenic mythology, etc. That continues here. I remind you that when Constantinople was refounded, Byzantium was refounded, Constantinople, as the center of a new world by Constantine, the way the emperor designed, for example, the education of clerks, of, say, bureaucrats, of administrators, in part those would have become also senators. So people also from lower birth compared to the violently ultra-elite senatorial nobility of Italy, for example, of Rome, had to learn a standardized version that was essentially a pack of Hellenic literature. It was literally like the Iliad, the Odyssey. Yes, there was also, like, of course, Latin text, etc., but they were mostly compressed, and alongside, as we explained before, also as far as the military ethos, what had historically been the Hellenic world, which also makes sense because, again, you're in the East, you're in a Greek city, there are people speak Greek, right? It's completely normal. This helped informing further, even in times of later crises like this one, especially when the system re-shrunk to a mostly Greek one, the same worldview as we were, the same solidity of the empire, together with this worldview, in a more unitary, cohesive sense, right? This, again, is particularly important. In Basileus, there was naturally a lot of Macedonian influence, because they had had kings, and that was properly the name since the Argead dynasty, etc. So just imagine what Alexander had done, the legacy in that, and the fact that Alexander himself, as you know, had introduced in his style of leadership much from the same Achaemenid tradition. It was more lordly, more tendentially feudal, coming again all from this more Indo-European seigneurial feudal background of the steppe, that was informed also with a bit more of reflection from the subjects, especially in the Middle East, of some servilism and subjugation to these fresher races, right? And so that had been inherited a bit by the Greeks as well. The Basileus as some sort of lord, right? That absolutely has some sort of higher, universal, cosmic, divine meaning, but it's not quite the same original title of Augustus, of Imperator in particular. And so significantly driving away from the Latin, the very Latin etymology and Indo-European worldview that had expressed that, or at least there is another Indo-European etymology to an extent, but again, coming from another branch another culture, you can argue. So the title of Basileus, as you know, endured with minor variations until the empire's end. Later, following Charlemagne's coronation, to distinguish itself from the West, the Emperor of Constantinople adopted the title Basileus Romaion, meaning Emperor of the Romans. And in the 10th century, when Bulgar Tsars also adopted the title of Basileus, the term autocrator was reintroduced. So this actually tells how sort of relative, even the attachment to the same traditional titles actually had been. Why? Because if you are the emperor, obviously they consider themselves Romans, but for example, when you realize that much of this Romanity had been mostly reinvigorated as an official titling, because there was basically somebody else in the West that had resumed the same empire that by then was metaphysically Roman in ethnicity by just providential design, and obviously could not be but the Roman empires. Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans in the West. It's at that point actually that the official name of the Basileus is associated with one of the Romans, right? Which is quite fascinating because it basically, you see, for all the times we see the guys say, oh, no, these were the actual Romans or whatever. If you look at the title, their true name was Emperors of the Romans. Yes, but since when? Meaning not that they were Roman, okay? It's obvious that they didn't use this in official titling because it was superfluous and everybody knew that was Romania and whatever. It's not like they thought to be the emperors of China, right? Even though in their mentality, of course, they were the emperors of the world. They knew, by the way, that were the Chinese, there were contacts between the two empires still at this time and beyond. But the necessity of styling the Romanity of the empire further, right, in the official title, is actually something that the Byzantines, the Basileoi of Constantinople, do only after Charlemagne has been, quite candidly speaking, by the way, appointed by the Pope as Emperor of the Romans. Now, this is fascinating because you could think the Pope would be now copying the imperial title, right? Instead, it is the one that, in sort of less formal ways, but still as official as they got, this crowned Charlemagne in Rome as Emperor of the Romans, right? So it's weird, in a sense, to realize that it seems that the first ones who used the title of Emperor of the Romans were actually the Westerners, not the Byzantines. This is actually, we have to spend this because it's a very important notion, right? It's part of the arsenal of you can use against those who claim all the time, now the Byzantines were the only true Romans, blah blah blah. Naturally, I'm not going to digress also on the concept of Romanity of the empire. Surely Charlemagne, by just lifestyle, resembled much more what an archaic Roman would have thought of an imperator than the Basileus back then. It's not to say, I mean, look at Heraclius. He was one of the greatest generals in Byzantine history. It's not to say, of course, that they lacked experience in command, but not all of them were that. Whereas in the West, that was at least a greater necessity, or at least it had remained as part of the broader traditional understanding, and that was put into action quite along the same pattern. So this is, I think, particularly interesting and important to stress. Besides, the same occurs with the Bulgars. When the Bulgars call themselves Tsars and Basileoi, so this is interesting because, for example, the same Bulgars reacquired the concept of Caesar that existed. By the way, it was, as you know, historically, also in Roman times, I don't know, Vespasian with Titus, like the father was the Augustus, of course, the heir apparent was Caesar, even though it hadn't been formalized. Think about Diocletian's tetrarchy. So it's not like those terms had not been used by the Byzantines, or again, so the Byzantines did not call themselves Romans at this point. Absolutely not. But it's still weird, or at least so utilitarianly instrumental, how they would suddenly reintroduce major terms, like, for example, autocrator, that stresses literally the fact that power stems from you as the divine medium of the world, basically. And so it's a very old and traditional principle, just because, again, they had to trigger the Bulgars. We had basically used now some title that rivaled with them, or at least that just by using was leveling, no, it was reaching the same Byzantine level in practice. Excuse me, to drink a little again. And therefore, the Byzantines felt they had to further qualify themselves from, right? If you are, this is my consideration, a truly universal ruler of a truly universal empire, which also, by all what we have explained in this video, obviously you can't quite claim to be anymore compared to the previously, much more extended Roman Empire, because let's be honest, this was basically a third of the original Roman Empire, or even less when we look at even just the sheer level of power and etc. You are that, all right? The official title should be the single most straightforwardly solid and unchangeable aspect of your rule, the most basic, the most elementary, the most notionistic almost, right? And so recurring to this kind of tricks does not quite sound right, or at least there is surely a majesty to the imperial achievements of Constantinople. There is surely a great power wielded by the Byzantines. There is a great civilizational success, all in all, because what we described here with the thematic reform definitely is a success. At the end of the day, it just for existing, it means that the empire survived. And again, in those circumstances, it was already a massive feat to pull off, which also other powers around didn't quite succeed in doing. All true, but at the same time, if you realize how legalistically nominal, or nominally legalistic for that matter, the Byzantine Empire had become in the defense of its exclusive Romanity, when there were great powers that were, by the way, appointed by the ultimate apostolic, let's say, authority, priesthood, by blessing, in fact, the same imperator in arms in the West as Emperor of the Romans, well, you don't look too well, like by claiming that, okay, well, yes, you're kind of this puts, by the way, also in perspective how the Byzantines accepted at a point to recognize Charlemagne as an emperor. And that is even weirder, because the question is, yes, emperor, but of what, right? It's complicated, admittedly. That was done for diplomatic reasons, but there is only one emperor, truly, right? Then you should explain why also non-Christian rulers exist with so much power, like the Abbasids, whatever. But at the same time, the level of power should always be recognized by divine standard, and especially in the face of a Christian power. I mean, you're not really in a good place. And it's all understandable from a Byzantine perspective to claim the veritable Romanity of power in continuity with that and with the same imperial might that they represented, but not its exclusivity. And this is something that if people especially studied more papal history, which of course they haven't the palest idea of what it even means or is, they would understand much better, because you would see there how the same Pope understood, and not even just the Pope for that matter, but basically everybody involved, that the, let's say, the imperial nature of power was of universal kind, right? Of course, in part it had been lost, traditionally wise, because the world ages, so to say, but it's not lost in the sense that it's to be mistaken with some sort of other, say, force coming out of nowhere, because the only way these guys saw power was as divinely bestowed. And so they could have lived in the most sort of fragmented world ever, but this would have not really meant that they could have explained, the existence of power in any other way. We know this very well from our videos about tradition, so we don't have to be particularly repetitive about it for that matter. Rather, I am glad to have made this videos, because as I said in the first one, in the first part, the reform, the thematic reform, is one of the single most important chapters to properly get well in Byzantine historiography. From one side, it shows that these reforms, it's not like they did not exist, but let's say they did not exist as an actual measure, a single point in time or in place. They were just the, very Occamianly, the natural consequence and natural, so to say, development of from a condition of crisis with all the challenges that the empire had and more. Right. On the other, it shows how much this process actually destructured the Catholic understanding of the empire before. I would say this is particularly important. It would be interesting to see how all the elements that we registered, for example, were already there from previous times, and they and how much they were, for example, specifically pertinent to the East in the moment, for example, in which the two halves of the empire were separated, so to say. I drink again. For a simple fact that you could measure through that how much of that truly imperial Catholic unity was proper of the system or not. It would be very, very interesting to compare this to the West as well. Like through many videos, for example, talking more about the various senatorial aristocracies in the various chunks of the empire, but also how much, again, this understanding of the continuity of Romanity in multiple parts of the world, as it had been, by the way, for the West. Again, the separation between East and West had been formally administered, and as long as it had existed, by the way, everybody was fine with that. And these two parts could be antagonistic to a degree, but it's not like they went at war with one another. If not in case of usurpations or whatever, they did nasty things to one another. But let's say, I don't know, if at the Battle of Cape Bon, Gaiseric had been defeated, Roman Africa, Vandal Africa would have been given back to the western half, even though it was the East that had put the fleet together. So it's interesting to see how at a certain point what we actually call the great continuation of the empire in the East, because these were fully Roman and whatever, was, however, also reduced in its Catholic meanings. It was reduced in its traditional understanding of Romanity, and had actually lost something to that, right? And so I think this is part of the reason why we call them Byzantines. As I often say, I don't call the Byzantines Byzantine for smearing them or saying that they're not Roman. On the contrary, to me, Byzantine is a beautiful term. However, the more I study Byzantine history, the more I can't help but noticing the heavy process of destructuration that all these sort of changes encompassed. And so rather than seeing the Byzantine Empire as a simple, it's as if, I don't know, I can't think of a proper term, but, you cut one piece, it remains completely homogeneous to what it was before. It's pure Romanity in the sense, at least, that the standards by which that Romanity was conceived were still upheld and or celebrated or understood or used properly for identity for the same imperial rule as before. This is not the case, and this can't be denied in the sense that we're not really criticizing the Byzantines for this. Right, we're criticizing for because they were the Byzantines, but we're criticizing everybody for having lost the empire. What about the Italians, so to say, or anyone else for that matter? Imperial power would reactivate historically, even from those same lands. Again, the Latin Germanic West has a truly imperial Roman tradition going on. However, again, what we're looking at is overall, even beyond the Byzantines, of a Catholic dimension was fragmented in power, right? You can't, first of all, nor pretend that this crash, this sort of shrinking had not happened. You can't pretend that there wasn't, for example, an enemy and also an enemy force playing against this, as you can't deny that there were in the West those who were maintaining the same Western standards of historical Romanity, and that there is no other reason but subjectivistically wanting to pretend that it was just the Byzantines who were Romans under their same legalistic terms that did not match with what had been just the metaphysics, the theology of this all. So when we look at medieval civilization, we definitely do see a world that had lost great part of traditional knowledge and understanding, even though it was so much traditional compared to, the modern age, the contemporary era, right? And we can't pretend, in fact, that, the Byzantines were just a universe world without, that was just continuing to go as Rome, and that you simply have to shear as if we were in a random AI-run paradox or total war game and say, oh, look, it's still standing after all these turns, after all these wars. It doesn't make any sense. You should celebrate Byzantine history, culture, identity, civilization, and more as Roman, right? As properly as with its Roman elements of legacy and meaning. And you should especially recover the deeper core, in fact, of Sebastocratic rule, of deep universal Catholic meaning, because also the official name of the Orthodox Church still today is Catholic, even though people do not understand what even Catholic means, for that matter. I think it's sort of a different confession of Christianity. As much as you should, in fact, see this in the West, as much as you should see this in the, I would say, more marvelous form of the West, that at the end of the day was incredibly much more re-expansive than the same Byzantine one on the longer run, and providing, in fact, with a much more impactfully lasting influence than the same great Byzantine civilization ultimately did. Because what is Byzantine civilization, or what is also Romanity in this picture? Again, I'm glad on Schwerpunkt to discuss this, because many people, I've seen, by the way, that the first part of this is not getting as many views as I hoped. This is not so much important because, again, these videos, generally speaking, end up for getting views, and especially if I make 2 hours long videos, we will get there easily. But I'm glad because we have made so many other videos that have sort of reinforced this problem, especially that have recently come up. For example, if I look at my Byzantine history playlist here. Where is it? We have this videos that I recently made: Byzantine spirituality, the Greek Orthodox survival in the Caliphate, and the prelude to the iconoclasm. All right. You have this partially in... there are some videos I made along that pattern, but there was that one about... yes, this is especially like Romanized Germans, barbarized Byzantines, and the hard-to-die myth of Latin Germanic backwardness. That's incredibly important, right? I made others along the same pattern, but I think these ones are especially the leading ones in all the picture. All right, because they give you a sense of depth of what this empire actually was. Right? We still have to cover so much about Byzantine history. I mean, it doesn't end here. We can't just stop it in this sense. I'm glad, again, we're making more videos about Byzantine history in general, because it's one of those topics you can't untreat. However, I realize sometimes also my videos are heavy in the sense that, good luck with watching 4 hours on the Byzantine thematic reforms. It's going to be harsh, right? Rather than hard, because it's really like, if you want to understand this, you must watch it all. You can't escape this. You can't pretend this is something else. We're unseen it. All right. At the same time, it's important to ponder about this all. It's important to look at this and simply realize that history is never random, right? The more I studied history, the more I realized that there's always an explanation, and this explanation is often much simpler than we think, because if anything, it's based on a much more self-evident reality than very often we want to accept, right? And so you pass to see, from seeing things in a certain way to straightly to another, the more you know the system. Here I realize I've made a video. This is the 136th video about Byzantine history. I think it's pretty important, right? We made so many videos about this topic that it's a bit difficult to say not to appreciate the effort and how much we have we will continue doing, because again, Byzantine history is an evergreen, and especially in the first years of the channel, it's probably, I don't know how long this will continue, but there's been an important concentration of Byzantine history content. At the beginning especially was very appreciated. The more time passed, the more I concentrated with Latin Germanic West. It seems like it's less relevant in a way, because I think people really began to understand more. Like, if you go, this may simply be based on my YouTube experience, and on the fact that ever more people who agree with me subscribe to my channel. So I don't really get too much confirmation bias. It's a thing in many ways, but it's also, let's say, an important reminder that it's easy to control people's minds in many ways, right? So you should be really aware of everything you do, and when you get too much sort of support, you should understand why it is. And I have, I think, some good antenna to grasp this. On the other hand, the main picture, so to say, is also one of increased realization from the side of my same followers. If I look, for example, Facebook groups, pages, considerations about the Byzantine Empire, I think we're stopped to memes of 10 years ago. All right. When I still didn't have the channel and I searched for, like, even later, I posted stuff in the first years on Facebook groups, and I just look just at this stuff. We have gone a lot ahead, all right, and I would especially stress this as we go ahead with this content. This content is not, in a sense, first of all, is not to be given for granted. This is, I think, the most important aspect of the story. We can't simply look at this and pretend that we haven't learned something, right? There are still people out there that are asking for sources, whatever, and I don't know what to say anymore. If after this you still don't get it, it's not the problem of the others anymore. If anything, however, it's become difficult maybe just to follow me. Sometimes it's difficult to, again, it's mostly because of the algorithm. Videos are gonna be watched, but if they don't spike for some reason, for example, that video about Manzikert boomed, literally boomed. It's kept being watched, I see here. Anatolia fell not due to Manzikert, but as Byzantines settled Turks to expel Normans from Amazay. That is also an eye-opener, right? And if you want to get history in sort of real depth, you should understand that all this content is interconnected. That once you make one of these videos and you're able to see certain things along the way, you can't unsee it later. All right? You can't sort of pretend it's not really some sort of impression or subjective experience just per se. It is, right? But it is also based on actual, say, on a path of actual objectivity, right? How much can we say here? I reached also this time the 2 hours threshold, which is important for propagandistic reasons. And we are going to surely talk about this another time. Again, I mean, the themes are an evergreen, but I hope it's clearer now. Regardless of my digressions and everything, we have said what we had to say as a basis, like 4 hours, just to introduce the topic. Seems appropriate, and exactly what we're expected to doing here. I'm yawning because I arrive at the end of the evening. I eventually have to go to sleep, but in any case, not just after I stop recording. For today, however, I stop it here. In fact, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.